All right, so we are going to tackle the first part of the Canterbury Tales. We're going to look at the beginning parts of the prologue, and then we're going to look at our first three characters, the knight, the squire, and the yeoman. Now, these are all three kind of linked together anyway. They travel in a group, so it's fitting to have them. Now, the thing with the Canterbury Tales prologue is I could do this in 2 days. And we could just railroad our way through it. But I think it would be better, our time would be better spent if we go slowly and we look at what actually is being done with this. Now, yesterday, we covered a lot of the background of this, and that's in another section of your notes. We talked about Chaucer. We talked about like the importance of this work. I know it's arguable. I'm not the only one who feels this way, but I think this is the most important work in British literature in their canon period. Yes, more important than any of Shakespeare's stuff. Shakespeare's stuff is good; it has great value, but this to me is where British literature really takes off, and it's never been topped since then. Now, you guys are not going to feel that way. I'll tell you right now that most of you are going to struggle with this. It is not an easy thing to read, even with it being like updated into a much more, I say modern, I'm putting that in quotation marks, modern form of English. It's still difficult, all right? And the beauty of it was lost on me as well. You know, the thing is that first of all, the structure that Chaucer locked himself into to write the way he did is amazing. That by itself required a lot. But the undertaking, even though he didn't finish it, what he was trying to do is quite impressive, to be honest with you. And really, I absolutely adore the idea of social commentary in literature, period, which is another reason why I love this, because every character is designed to make a statement, okay? Now, if you go on the internet and Google stuff, you're going to get all sorts of ridiculous statements, especially like for our first three, the yeoman. The yeoman has next to nothing mentioned about him, and we're going to talk about that, and we're going to take a stab at some things I think is going on. Now, guys, I took an entire year of studying Chaucer, and an entire semester was just on the Canterbury Tales, and of that semester, probably half of it was spent on the prologue and talking about what's going on. So this is a mixture of ideas I got from college as well as things that I've just picked up from teaching this for 14 years. So you're not going to find a lot of places on the internet that agree with everything I say, and that's totally fine. This has become bigger than just, what did Chaucer initially mean? Because, we're not in that time period anymore. So much further along, and the world's different, but yet we can still get a lot out of this. And really, when you start looking at the characters and figuring out what they represent, you think what they represent today, where we can see these same characters, I think that's really useful, and also shows us an important thing about human nature is that it doesn't change. People today in 2020 are no different from the people in the 1300s to all the way back to, Adam and Eve, okay? I mean, people just don't change. We struggle with the same things. We care about the same things. That's just being a human, okay? And being a human has not that big of a difference from the beginnings of recorded history and probably earlier. So what we're going to do first, though, is we're going to start with the first 18 lines of this poem, which are found on page 97 in your textbook, if you're using the same book I have. This is probably, and I'm going to say arguably, in literary circles, this is the most famous 18 lines in literature, period, at least British literature. If you're talking about just like amateur fans of British literature, I know that seems like a funny statement, but there are such things. They're probably going to pull like the to be or not to be speech from Hamlet or something like this. But honestly, this is it. This is where literature in the British tradition really begins. I know we had Beowulf, but that was a mixture of Scandinavian and other things, and it was just kind of adopted by the British Isles. This Chaucer is the first real voice of the British people, in my opinion, and I think the most important writer of their time period, and arguably in history, okay? So let's look at these 18 lines. Now, it's going to sound funny because you got to think how old this is. By the way, your book actually has the original in Middle English, what it looked like, and most of you would struggle to get through that. You'd have to read it out loud and then kind of make sense of the words from that. But up there at the top part are these lines we're about to read in Middle English. Now, this is the more modern English, and I'm going to take my time to get through them, and I may stop at times just to kind of go over parts, okay? All right, let me get my glasses, though. All right, he says, "When in April the sweet showers fall and pierce the drought of March to the root and all, the veins are bathed in liquor of such power as brings about the engendering of the flower. When also Zephyrus with his sweet breath exhales an air in every grove and heath, upon tender shoots, and the young sun his half course in the sign of the ram has run, and the small fowl are making melody that sleep away the night with open eye, so nature pricks them and their heart engages. Then people long to go on pilgrimages, and palmers long to seek the stranger strands of far-off saints hallowed in sundry lands, and especially from every shire's end in England down to Canterbury they wend, to seek the holy blissful martyr quick, to give his help to them when they were sick. Now, that's all one sentence. That's why we didn't stop. We went all the way through it. By the way, I may mispronounce a few words, especially when we get to some of the proper nouns. Apologies on that ahead of time. I am from Alabama, and that means I have very limited ability to read anything properly. I mean, I can read it up here. Coming out of here is a different story. All right. So why is that so important, Mr. Morris? Who cares about that? Well, he's describing spring, right? Who cares? Well, writers since this was written have taken this as inspiration and used it as to comment on elements of it, to steal parts of it to use for their own writing. But I mean, the image here, and by the way, we're writing in a time period where the church still holds a lot of sway, but there's a lot of question being risen about the way the church is run. We're going to see the very corrupt nature of the Catholic Church at this time period. And what you get, and throughout this entire thing, is a mixture of the pagan and the religious, and the Christian. Let's not say religious. The pagan and the Christian. And so we have a lot of imagery here that points to ancient Greeks. We get a lot of imagery here that points to, again, pagan, the idea of nature as something to be worshipped. And we're going to, again, tie that in with Christianity here in a little bit too, okay? But there's some really pretty imagery here. This is a time period where there wasn't a lot of stuff written like this. Today it seems almost like, so what? But back then this would have been impressive. And to be honest with you, it still is, okay? The main thing we're getting out of this, though, is that in April, in spring, people come together and they go on pilgrimages, particularly to Canterbury, to where, I don't know if we've gotten to this point yet. Yeah, the Holy Blissful Martyr. They're talking about Sir Thomas Becket, who was murdered in his church. So kind of an important figure. And Canterbury is a very big location in the Catholic Church. It's a big location in British history. It's a big location for British literature, because I'm doing this off the top of my head. I think that's where Poets' Corner is, where they would have busts of famous writers, and Chaucer, I believe, was the first one they actually had. So there's a lot of really, and Poets' Corner may not be in Canterbury, to be honest with you, but I know that Chaucer's bust was the first one put in there because he's that important. So they're giving you the setup for this pilgrimage, where we're going to have all these 30 travelers go from the Tabard Inn, where we're starting, to Canterbury and back. And the plan was for them to tell multiple stories, to where this work would have been huge. I'll bring in a copy of the Decameron, which I think this is loosely like the idea stolen from. The Decamerons are older. But it has tons and tons of like folktale stories that have been kind of adapted for that work. Okay, and that's what Chaucer was doing here. Okay, let's read a little further. We still got a little bit more of the prologue to the prologue before we get to their characters, which is the knight is our first one. Okay, so now we're on 98. He says, "It happened in that season that one day in Southwark at the Tabard, as I lay ready to go on pilgrimage and start for Canterbury, most devout at heart, at night there came into that hostelry some 29, in a company of sundry folk, happening then to fall in fellowship. And they were pilgrims all, that towards Canterbury meant to ride. The rooms and stables of the inn were wide. They made us easy, all was of the best. And shortly, when the sun had gone to rest, by speaking to them all upon the trip, I soon was one of them in fellowship, and promised to rise early and take the way to Canterbury, as you heard me say." So basically, these 30 people, it's 29 plus the author, Chaucer, is our 30th person. And they're all sitting there and they talk and they find out they're all going to Canterbury and they're going to travel together. Now, this was interesting because Chaucer had to find a way to get people of, and if you listened to my lecture yesterday, of all three estates, first, second, and third estates, the nobility, the clergy, and then everyone else. He had to find a way to get all of these people together, which they never would be, to be honest with you, in that time period. Even today, you don't have a lot of instances where the middle, lower, and upper classes are, interacting. It's not a common thing. So he chose the pilgrimage, and of course they would want to travel in a group. You might say, well, why would these nobility want to travel with the serfs and peasants? Well, for safety. This trip, this pilgrimage was well known. Lots of people took it, and bandits knew that too. So it was a great place to hide out and try to catch people off guard and rob them. And rob them at least, if not kill them outright. So this was safer. A group of 30 traveling, no one's going to mess with them, especially when you've got some of these characters like the knight, who we're going to see in just a minute with them. So the point here is they all decide to travel together. And then, let's get a little further. He says, but nonetheless, while I have time and space before my story takes a further pace, it seems a reasonable thing to say what their condition was, the full array of each of them as it appeared to me, according to profession and degree, and what apparel they were riding in, and at a night I therefore will begin. So that ends our first little section. Now we're going to cover the knight, the squire, and the yeoman today as well. So don't shut off. We're going to still do that. But that gets us through, he said before we start talking about the actual, like, what's going on, we're going to go over, I'm going to list all 30 characters. And he cheats. He doesn't really give us 30. I think it's like 24 that we actually get. But anyway, the plan was to tell you about all 30 characters, who they are, what they look like, and that's it. There's no plot in this. It's just, here's a bunch of character descriptions. Now, if I just pitched it to you that way, you would be like, oh my gosh, really? We got to read this? And yeah, I get that. But each character description, when you couple it with the few tales we do have, it kind of fits that this character is more than just, here's what they look like. Even though that's what you may get. It's more about, like, here's what they look like, but they also represent something else. These are stereotyped figures, okay? If you go back to page... I thought they had a section on stereotyping. Well, they don't. They talk about direct and indirect characterization, which we'll go over as we get into this. But these are stereotyped figures. They become archetypal figures. Some of them, the knight, for example. But a lot of these are characters that are meant to represent more than just what we see here. All right, and every little detail matters. All right. And that's the key. That's what makes this such a brilliant piece of writing, is the more and more you dig into the individual details, the more you find out some really impressive things. Okay, all right, let's start with the knight here. We're going to read, he's got a pretty good section. He goes from line 42 all the way to line 80, all right? So and not all of them have that much, okay? But he's not the longest by far, but he does have, he's right in that middle ground, okay? Now, the knight is going to make up, so again, this is Mr. Morris's opinion, all right? That we have, of these characters, there are 3 flawless characters, okay? And you could, depending on who you read, you can find some people that feel like these characters are flawed. I would disagree strongly. But they represent each of one of the 3 estates. The first estate being the clergy. You're going to find the parson later, who's the ideal, perfect character. The second estate is the nobility. This is the knight. The knight is a perfect character. I read a critic who actually thinks that the knight is not, and I'll explain why when we get to that part, but I disagree with him completely, all right? Then finally, you'll get the plowman, who's the parson's brother, who is going to be your third estate perfect figure, and who is my favorite in the book. Later, I'll talk to you guys about listing the best and worst pilgrims, and often people put the parson as number 1 because, he is a Jesus figure, and he's a religious character. But I think the plowman represents what people should be so much more. But we don't get to talk about them today. We do get to talk about the knight, though. So let's take a stab at this, okay? And again, we'll read it, and we're going to stop and talk about it. We're going to point a bunch of little small details to the point you're going to get sick of it. All right, he says, there was a knight, a most distinguished man, who from the day on which he first began to ride abroad had followed chivalry, truth, honor, generousness, and courtesy. He had done nobly in his sovereign's war, and ridden into battle, no man more, as well in Christian as heathen places, and ever honored for his noble graces. So right away we get, this is a great guy. He's fought in multiple battles, in both like religious and secular battles. We get that he's followed chivalry, which, chivalry is this code of behavior that a knight was supposed to have towards other people. And, you get the stories about King Arthur and all, which we're going to tackle at a later date. But those told these romantic stories of knights and following chivalry. The fact is that in real life, knights were not very chivalrous and didn't follow this code. But this knight does. Now, I want to tell you ahead of time, before we get into this, you can't always trust that when Chaucer says something, he means it. A lot of times he's being sarcastic. That is not the case here. He's very clearly stating that this knight is a good guy. He follows chivalry. He says truth, honor, generousness, and courtesy. I mean, this guy is the real deal, okay? He says, when we took Alexandria, he was there. He often sat at a table in the chair of honor above all nations when in Prussia. In Lithuania he had ridden, and Russia. No Christian man so often of his rank. When in Granada, Algeciras sank. I don't know if I got that. Under assault he had been there, and in North Africa raiding Benamerin. In Anatolia he had been as well, and fought when Aias and Italia fell. For all along the Mediterranean coast he had embarked with many a noble host. In 15 mortal battles he had been, and jousted for our faith at Tramacent. thrice in the list and always killed his man. So we get a listing of battles here. And look, if we had more time and this was a college level class, we would break down these battles and show what they actually represent. Really, there's been a lot of scholarly articles written about this stuff where they look at that. Obviously, Chaucer chose these battles for a reason. A lot of them represent battling against the heathens and the pagans, okay? But again, there's a little bit of the critic that I disagree with argues that a lot of this is more about mercenary work, that the guy isn't really picking. He's picking battles where he's going to be able to make the most money, which would point to this guy as being greedy, which I'm not going to hold with. But it says he's fought in 15 battles, which in that time period, it's amazing that he survived all 15. He also mentions thrice in the list and always killed his man. They're talking about the jousting, and you guys have seen this on TV or something where, you've got two guys line up on their horse, and they got the big giant jousting lances, and they ride at each other and try to knock each other off the horses. They would set this up a lot like what we had seen in the Bible with David and Goliath. You get your best two guys, they would fight, the winner wins the battle. That's the best way to handle battles in this time period, because you don't want to lose a lot of your men to a battle, because then you're going to get picked off by somebody else. So as long as you would agree to abide by the rules, if my guy beats your guy, we win, this is what we're going to get out of it, then that would work. He's won, and it says he even killed his guy, which I guess is a positive. I mean, you would think that not showing mercy isn't a good thing, but I guess it just shows how dominant he truly was. All right. Now, remember, when I mentioned the greed part, we're going to talk a lot about the concept of the 7 deadly sins, which I think gets a lot of its weight from this work, believe it, not so much the Bible. But we're going to see each of the negative characters, the knight not being one, seems to embody at least one of these 7 deadly sins. Now, if you treat the knight as not being a perfect figure, he now would have greed as a definite one of the 7 deadlies for him, which a lot of these characters seem to possess. Okay, let's get through the knight. He says, this same distinguished knight had led the van once with the Bey of Balat doing work for him against another heathen Turk. He was of sovereign value in all eyes, and though so much distinguished, he was wise, and in his bearing modest as a maid. Now, there's where the knight gets a little bit of a difference. Okay, so being good in battle, there's a lot of knights that might fit that bill. But what's odd about him, and especially since he's part of this second estate, is that he's modest. Okay, normally they would be flashy. They would wear really bright things, maybe not during the battle, but afterwards they would change and want to say, hey, look at me, type of thing. The knights would frequently do that. Not this guy. He's very modest, and he's also wise. Two things that might not always be associated with knights. All right, so this is this is, if we're going to parallel it with today, we live in a culture that has an extreme case of military worship, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But the fact is that not everyone in the military is a great guy. All right, and or female. Or woman. So there's a lot of people in there who are not the greatest characters, but you do see, we always talk about those ones that, won a Medal of Honor or something, and those guys are. And that's what the knight is. One of the greatest moments of my life was when I had gone to do some observations at Paris Island with the Marines, and had spent an entire week there going through, watching the training, taking part in parts of it, in fact, and had a really good time. Learned a lot about what the Marines are trying to train out of people and what they're doing through every step of the process. But I got to sit and watch a graduation, which, high school graduation got nothing on a Marine graduation. And one of the coolest things I ever got to see was I got to sit next to a living Medal of Honor recipient who was a Marine, which there's not a lot of them. Usually the Marine Medal of Honor recipients get it posthumously, meaning they're dead. This guy was alive, and he was an amazing human being. I mean, he represented everything the military is supposed to be about. And so, you see guys like him and you have faith in what is going on with our military. And, then you can hear some awful stories too, but this guy represented everything that was right about it. And that's this. It's not just the ability to fight. It's not just hey, they went and fought for our country. That's not where it ends, though. It's the fact that this guy was modest. I mean, he sat and talked to me. I'm a nobody. I'm not even in the military. And he spent so much time talking with me and just sharing his experiences with me. So the modesty goes with it, and the wisdom. The man had so many important things he'd said, and he lived such an amazing life. And so that's this knight here. He's not one of the knights that goes off to battle so that he can, and we're going to see his son, the squire, is the other. He's not about the courtly love aspect, which was I'm fighting for a woman. Which, that's not a good, that's bad, Mr. Morris. It was when the woman was married, which she typically was, and it was a really dirty little love triangle situation. So that's what the knights would typically be about. And that's not what this one is about. And so he represents everything good, just like that Marine represented everything good about the military in my eyes. Oh, and along with that, just a little shout out here. Also, any of you who have families that have been here for a while, there's a guy that used to be the headmaster here, Tim Anderson, also a Marine, represents everything this guy is, the knight. He is everything about what the military can do to make an amazing human being. So those types of people deserve all the praise that are heaped upon our military, for sure. All right. Sorry, I had to mention that too. Okay, so he says, he never yet a boorish thing had said in all his life to any come what might. He was a true, a perfect, a gentle knight. Speaking of his equipment, he possessed fine horses, but he was not gaily dressed. He wore a fustian tunic stained and dark with smudges where his armor had left mark. Just home from service, he had joined our ranks to do his pilgrimage and render thanks. So that last little section about him talks about, again, he doesn't say anything boorish. Boorish meaning he's not boastful. Doesn't say stupid things. The man says the right things, and he keeps his mouth shut when that's called for as well. Says he has fine horses, which means he's probably fairly well off, which you would expect. 15 battles, he's probably done a good job and been rewarded highly for his service. It says but he doesn't get dressed gaily, and again, that means he's not brightly dressed with the whole "look at me, look how powerful I am," big crest on there. None of that. He's actually wearing his work clothes. I mean, he's got a tunic that's stained, and that's because he's come straight from the battles. As soon as he's gotten back, he's immediately going to give thanks, and that shows his respect to God. That he's going to do that. He didn't go home and get changed and put on his brightest stuff so he could say, "Hey, everyone, look how impressive I am." All right? The knight's an amazing guy. He really is. His son, the squire, is not so much. And again, a lot of the things you look at, the squire is treated like he's not a bad guy, and I'm not saying he is. But he definitely inhabits that middle ground where he's flawed in a lot of ways. And he represents a character type. It's not just this person. There's a reason why very few of them have names. It's about like the occupation and the description that goes with it. So let's see what the squire is and how he would apply to today. All right? This one's going to bug some of you, by the way. All right. He had his son with him, a fine young squire, a lover and cadet, a lad of fire, with locks as curly as if they had been pressed. He was some 20 years of age, I guessed. In stature, he was of moderate length, with wonderful agility and strength. He'd seen some service with the cavalry in Flanders and Artois and Picardy, and had done valiantly in a little space of time and hoped to win his lady's grace. Now, right away, what do we get? Well, squire is basically a knight's assistant. He's a knight in training, and it sounds like he's decent. He's a decent fighter. But while the knight is fighting for God and country, this guy's fighting for courtly love. He is fighting for a woman. And again, it's not this girl, his sweetheart from back home. Courtly love is a bad thing in many cases. Courtly love, again, was about, a lot of times marriages at this time were arranged, especially with the upper class, where wealthy was matched with wealthy. To basically sign treaties. So you'd have a woman married to a guy and she didn't like him, and it might be a 20-something-year-old woman married to some 60-year-old guy, and basically it's in treaty only the woman hates her husband, he doesn't have anything to do with her. So these knights would come along, these young knights, and they would kind of, have affairs with these ladies in different places, and would be like their champions, and they would wear pieces of their a veil or something they would keep with them as a prize. And that's his goal. His goal is to win a lady's grace and be part of that courtly love part of this. And it's the secular versus the religious. We talked about that at the beginning. And so while the knight fights for the religious elements, this guy's fighting for personal selfish reasons and the secular elements. Okay. He got an age, he's in his 20s. They talk about his hair being pressed, meaning he takes good care of himself, as opposed to his dad, who we just saw, who's still wearing his dirty tunic. This guy's dressed to the nines. In other words, he's got it all. He's the opposite of Mr. Morris. He actually cares about what he looks like, I guess. All right, let's keep going. There's more about this guy. It says he was embroidered like a meadow bright and full of freshest flowers, red and white. Singing he was, or fluting all the day. He was as fresh as is the month of May. Short was his gown, the sleeves were long and wide. He knew the way to sit a horse and ride. He could make songs and poems and recite, knew how to joust and dance, to draw and write. So, you may not get all the references to his clothing, but he's dressed in a fancy, fashionable way. All right, again, something the knight wouldn't do. The knight's not gaily dressed. His son definitely is. It also points out all these other things he has. He's a good fighter, but he's also good at poetry and music, and he's got all these talents, which is great, except he's not focused on anything. You know, he does well at a bunch of things, but he hasn't really specialized like his dad did in anything. And it also shows, especially in this time period, it shows a lack of dedication to one discipline. He just kind of does a little bit of everything. Plus, a lot of that stuff is stuff about, again, look at me type of things, okay? So he'd sit around and recite poetry to people or play music so they could all pay attention to him. All right? Says he loved so hotly that till dawn grew pale. He slept as little as a nightingale. Courtesy he was, lowly and serviceable, and carved to serve his father at the table. Now, that's the end of the squire, but let's talk about those last little details. Now, one of the things I will do for you that a lot of teachers won't in a high school is I'm going to point to the more scandalous elements of this, too. And a lot of people may disagree with me about whether that's what it means or not, but I feel like I have enough to say that this is it. When it says he loved so highly that till dawn grew pale, he slept as little as a nightingale, this guy's a ladies' man. He's got lots of ladies, lots of girls. He's spending too much time awake with them, not enough time sleeping. He's a soldier. That's a bad idea. Okay, it really is. It also points to, again, when we talk about the 7 deadly sins, the guy's obviously lustful. All right, lust is one of the 7 deadly sins. Historically, it's been considered that. So he definitely fits with lustfulness. Some people say sloth because he's lazy, but you don't really get that he's lazy. He doesn't sleep much, but that's because he's awake. I mean, he's awake all the time. It doesn't say he sleeps all day the next day. It says he sleeps very little. So I don't think sloth fits, but lust definitely fits with this guy. All right? So they say he's courteous, he was lowly and serviceable. So in other words, he's not bad at what he does. He's not a bad guy. He just really likes the ladies. And sometimes picks them over what he should be doing, okay? So, if we talked about the knight being maybe that Medal of Honor recipient, or we pick the elite of our military represents the knight, who does the squire represent? Well, you're not going to like this, but the squire's really teenagers, all right, in a lot of ways. I know that's a stereotype, but that's part of the deal here, okay? We're talking about these stereotyped figures, what they represent, and then how do we combat that? What do we do to change that, all right? So this is our first negative stereotype, and he's really not negative. He's just right there in the middle. But guys, that's kind of an attitude people have, especially adults have towards teenagers now. And as much as we may not or you may not like it, there's a lot of you that fit that bill. A lot of you do, in fact, focus on the wrong things, can't concentrate on one thing. A lot of you are much more obsessed with the relationships than you are with bettering yourselves. There's a lot of things that fit. And, I mean, he's that age group too. So, I mean, he's great. He's a young person. He's in his 20s. So think about 15 to 25, that time period. That's what this is, okay, except in the 1300s versus 2020, all right? Let's look at our last character, because I know this video is getting really long, okay? Our last character is the Yeoman, and good luck finding stuff about him on the internet, but Mr. Morse is here to try to give you something, okay? All right, let's just read it. His is very short. It says, there was a yeoman with him at his side, no other servant, so he chose to ride. This yeoman wore a coat and hood of green, and peacock-feathered arrows, bright and keen and neatly sheathed, hung at his belt the while, for he could dress his gear in yeoman style. His arrows never drooped their feathers low, and in his hand he bore a mighty bow. His head was like a nut, his face was brown. He knew the whole of woodcraft up and down. A saucy brace was on his arm to ward it from the bowstring, and a shield and sword hung at one side, and at the other slipped a jaunty dirk, spear sharp and well equipped. A medal of St. Christopher he wore, of shining silver on his breast, and bore a hunting horn, well slung and burnished clean, that dangled from a baldric of bright green. He was a proper forester, I guess. That's it. That's the whole thing about the yeoman. So first of all, the initial question is always, what's a yeoman? So your book just says he's an attendant. It's more than that, but that's fine. We'll leave it at that. So yeoman, he works for the knight. He's the knight's servant. The squire is not. The squire is his son, and he's training up his son. But the yeoman is his servant, which tells you some indirect characterization about the knight. He's not very high maintenance, right? He just needs one servant with him, which is pretty good. But this servant is also there for protection. He's got that bow, so he's there to help the knight out. But it details mainly his clothing he wears. We know nothing about this guy except what he wears, and he's got a whole lot of weapons. All right, we talk about bows. When he talks about let's see, we got the peacock feathers, a mighty bow, which goes with that, a saucy brace. If you look at the bottom, brace is a bracelet, but it also indicates the. No, that's right. I don't want to use that. Brace is also used for a pair of daggers. Not here. This is it's to protect from the bowstring, so it's on his wrist. Shield and sword. A Johnny Dirk, that's a dagger for sure. And he's got a St. Christopher medal, St. Christopher being the patron saint of travelers. So that would be fitting for this journey. That's meant to set up some characters later who are wearing stuff that doesn't really fit with them, particularly the next person that we'll study tomorrow, the nun. So a lot of these are meant to be contrasting images, okay? So he's got a lot of guns. Guns. He doesn't have any guns. Let's see if this comes back on. Sorry, phone rang. I'm trying to interrupt that, so apologize for that little moment right there in the middle. No guns. The guy's just carrying lots of weaponry that would fit the time period, okay? He also has a hunting horn and a baldric. Let's see, what's a baldric at the bottom? A belt to support a sword. So, I mean, the picture you've got on page 100 doesn't even do him justice. This guy's loaded down. Now, here's the thing about him. Frequently, you'll just get that it just represents... it's meant to characterize the knight, and this guy's just... I don't think Chaucer's that lazy. I think there's more to it. For me personally, when I've studied this guy, it talks about all the clothing he's got and all the weapons he's got, and they're all in really good shape. And then the key to me is the last line. He was a proper forester, I guess. When Chaucer throws the I guess in there like that, he typically means he's not. So, he's posing as a proper forester, but look at all the stuff he's got. Does a forester need all this extra stuff? It'd be like today if a forester's carrying around, a bazooka and AR-15 and got all this other stuff. You begin to wonder what he's really doing in the forest, So this guy, to me, comes off like there's a couple things about him that are fake. And I think that's what we're dealing with here. And that could be several. If we're going to try to pair him up with the 7 deadly sin, it could be pride, maybe. He's got all this fancy stuff to look the part, even though, he's really not, according to Chaucer, at least how I see it. So it also shows that if he's got all this nice weaponry, he's obviously not using it, right? That would be my opinion. It's like, why do you have all this stuff? And again, if we're trying to look, and this one's kind of hard to parallel to like an occupation day, but we're not trying to do that. We're trying to parallel it to images we might see today. This reminds me of, if you've ever played sports and you've been on a team, and you got that guy who's just terrible, or that girl who they're not very good, but they've got all the best equipment. They've got the best shoes. They've got all of the fancy stuff. They've got everything to be the pinnacle of this if fashion was all that mattered. And that's this guy. He seems to fit that bill for me. So definitely a pride issue because he wants to look the part, but he doesn't want to do what it takes to be the part. All right. Now, like I said, you're going to find rarely anything that will agree with what I just said. They don't usually put that much detail into it, but that's one of the notes I put on your paper was the importance of knowing that small details matter in works like this. If it didn't, it wouldn't be there. Why do you need 30 people? If this guy doesn't serve any purpose beyond he's the knight servant, then you just don't need him. You can drop him out and you can fill the squire with that position, but that's not what's going on here. The guy has value, and you have to be careful about Chaucer's wording. The I guess really throws the entire section into question when he does that. Okay? Now, I know he mentioned it somewhere with the knight, I think. The word guest came up, but the context is very different, all right? So that's the key with this guy. All right, guys, I know that's a long video. I love talking about this. If you can't tell, this is one of my passions. I love the Canterbury Tales. And I've got a lot of this is my own observations and my own, completely wrong ideas probably. But I think it's more interesting than just saying, hey, he's a forester and probably a good one. And that's all you can say, which is what you get from some of the more popular internet websites when you're trying to Google these characters. So, all right, let's end there. Tomorrow we're going to cover the nun, who's an interesting character. The monk, this is going to be your first 2 religious characters, and the friar. You get 3 in a row. In increasing levels of badness as well. So we're going to, wade into a mess tomorrow with some of the religious figures, all right? So anyway, thank you for your time. Thank you for bearing with me if you made it all the way to the end of this. Congratulations. That's quite an undertaking. All right, guys, have a great evening.